First of all, I guess I speak in the name of all of us, saying that, well, how I wish you were here. And sorry for inviting your private office, probably at home, but at least we all got dressed up to have this honor to speak with you over via Skype. Please give me a minute to introduce you properly to the audience, okay, here in Lisbon. Okay. So Luke is a political sociologist with interests in socialism, alternative societies, social movements, and global politics. Currently, he is writing a book on alternative societies. This will look at utopianism, communism, participatory economies, counterculture in communes, alternative communities within capitalism, gender and race equal society, green society, the free university, society free from paid work, society without borders, and the slow society. However, what we still have in mind probably is his last book from 2010, The Sociology of Globalization. And what I remember well are his papers where he was discussing, or where he put forward a critique on Ulrich Beck's cosmopolitanism, namely in global inequality, human rights, and power. Luke is also doing a great job, very interesting for all of us in the current situation, by writing on universities and what's going on in our midst. A lot of papers, not only on what went on in Sussex, I guess, with the occupation, but on the marketization of our universities and the future for the graduate without a future. Coming back to the current situation of crisis, about social democracy after the crisis in Europe and the crisis of social democracy, well, the Occupy movement, and so on and so forth. So, Luke, we very much look forward. I already had helped to distribute your handout. Thanks a lot for sending this. And I will now escape from this platform, so it is all yours, and we are listening to you. The floor is yours. Thanks a lot to be here virtually with us. I come back to you when you finished, okay? See you later.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to come to Lisbon. And I'm sorry that I didn't actually make it physically to Lisbon, but it's great that the internet has allowed me to come anyway in the end. I wanted to talk about obviously the themes of the conference, of which are austerity, inequality and rights, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about alternatives to austerity policies, and I wanted to just mention examples from the UK, but just to try and draw some comparisons between Southern Europe and the UK, because basically we have austerity policies here as well. They're nowhere near as serious as the ones that you're facing in Portugal and also in Spain and Greece. But the other difference here about the UK is that we don't have the sort of direct involvement of the Troika in the way that you do. So I really wanted to raise a couple of examples from the UK, partly because it just shows that really austerity policies are as much something which is pursued by national elites as by external European powers, which are seen to be undermining national democracy. So I'll start off by just saying a few things about the austerity project and discourses of austerity, and then I'll try and move on to say a few things about alternatives. And I guess what's really happened with the austerity project, it seems to me, is that it's sort of monopolised the political agenda in a situation in a post-financial crisis period when there should have been a chance for a more egalitarian and rights-based politics. The financial crisis created great opportunities for a politics based around equality and rights. and it created the possibility for a politics based around the regulation of finance and capital, which was seen to be behind a lot of the problems of the financial crisis. And there was a good popular mood after the financial crisis for greater taxation of finance towards more sort of social ends, and for things like greater taxation of financial taxes and taxes on financial transactions. But this kind of politics I've talked about, this more egalitarian, rights-based politics, hasn't really been taken up despite the chance it had after the financial crisis. Mainly because those in power weren't really committed to this kind of sort of approach, and there's been a much more important influence for corporations and capital in sort of determining the way that politics go. And I think one of the important things about austerity is that it's been presented as something which is necessary and unavoidable, and we have to reduce deficits in all sorts of European countries, and that there's no alternative. So it's been presented not as an ideological thing, but as a technocratic thing, as a technical solution. And Nina mentioned a minute ago, kindly mentioned my globalisation book I wrote, and one of the interesting things when you research globalisation is you see that we had a similar situation in the past where neoliberal policies were justified using discourses of globalisation, which said you have to pursue neoliberalism, there's no real alternative because global capital will just flee if you don't pursue more neoliberal policies. And we've seen that that was a misleading argument, because the Latin American left have pursued radical policies. In a more moderate sense, we've had very welfare, high tax policies pursued in Scandinavia and Germany and places like this. So it became pretty clear that these discourses which said that neoliberalism or austerity are necessary policies are not quite true. There's much more choice involved. So I really think what's going on here with austerity is an ideological project rather than a necessary one that we have to take, and it's also one which I think is a class project. And I wanted to say something a little bit about the discourse austerity, because discourses are things which are used to mobilise people behind a particular project, and the austerity discourse has been quite a clever one in a way. It's basically represented the private sector and richer sections of society and the political right against the public sector and poorer groups in society. It's presented the problems that we're facing has to do with the public sector, when many people would argue these are problems which go back a bit further and are to do with the operation of finance, for instance in the American subprime mortgage market going back years ago, but it's managed to deflect the blame for this onto the public sector, which is seen as too big. Government is seen as an inefficient way of running a whole set of industries and services, and there are these stories of lazy Greeks and things like this, people who work in the public sector as being problematic, and people who receive social payments or welfare payments from the state are seen as projected in this discourse as not deserving those payments, as undeserving, and they're divided from more sort of hard-working citizens. And I think these things vary from country to country, obviously, but I think we've also seen this discourse in relation to immigration. So immigrants are seen, certainly in my country, the government projects immigrants as people who are coming trying to get health, welfare payments for free, whereas the British or the people from the home country are seen as the deserving sort of people. So you've got these sort of discourses which are managing to shift the blame away from banks and the private sector and richer groups in society onto the public sector. And my experience is that the public have been quite persuaded by these discourses. If you look at, I couldn't say for Portugal for sure, but if you look at some countries and you look at the value surveys and opinion polls, lots of people in European countries accept, wrongly in my view, but they accept that austerity is a necessary and inevitable thing that we have to go through because of the financial crisis. And so the discourse of austerity, I think, has managed to shift the blame away from the richer sectors of society and defend an ideological project of deconstructing, taking apart the public sector. And it's also had big implications for inequalities and rights, which I'm not going to say too much about because I'm conscious that there's been a whole day of sophisticated talks about this, which are probably much more sophisticated than I could do. But finance capital has been bailed out as a result of austerity policies, rather than taking any sort of blame for these policies. Capital in a way has sort of solidified its power or maintained its power rather than had its power sort of put into question, there was a great opportunity to do that after the financial crisis. In many countries there have been inequalities in income, so much widening disparities between the poor and the rich in societies. Nina mentioned about that one of my concerns has been with the marketisation of the universities, which is happening in the UK, but I guarantee it's going to come in your direction as well.
It is already here.
It's already there.
Well,
okay. So basically the marketisation and privatisation of public services has been a sort of response to. So in a way, I guess what I'm saying here is that some social rights, if we're talking about inequalities and rights, some social rights are being taken away here because they've been privatised and turned over to the market. I think also there's been an ideological inequality has grown greater since the 1980s. Sort of more conservative and neoliberal discourses became dominant, and a sort of social democratic and welfarist sort of policies in the 1980s was marginalised, and I think under austerity that's become even more strongly the case. And also, I'm just really conscious that in terms of inequalities and rights, there's been big changes to political rights and civil rights. So there's been very heavy-handed policing of protests, anti-austerity protests. So I know you've had strikes and demonstrations just recently in Portugal, almost to the extent where dissent has been criminalised. So in the UK, the government has explicitly asked judges to give longer prison sentences to people who were arrested for disorder offences on protests. It was made quite open that was expected of judges. So I think there's been these inequalities which have grown, and these erosions of sort of social and political rights. And like I said earlier on, this has not just happened in Southern Europe, but it's happened in other parts of Europe. And I think what that shows is that, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's not just the Troika which are implementing these proposals, it's national elites in all the different countries. So the Portuguese national elite, the Greek one, the French one, and so on are all part of this project. So I wanted to move on now to say a little bit more about alternatives, because I'm conscious that what I've talked about so far is probably what has been raised already today. And I wanted to talk about three sort of alternative austerity policies. So one is a more traditional or old-fashioned one, but in a way I think has become more in tune with current times. And a couple of other alternatives are to do with work and to do with the movement of people. So, and I think we have to really fight for these alternatives, because this austerity discourse has become a sort of popular common sense that's accepted and dominates the mainstream, and other alternatives are outside the mainstream, and we really have to fight to get these on the agenda. So in terms of a traditional and old-fashioned response to austerity politics, I think that alternative has to sort of build a discourse which is convincing in the same way that austerity discourses have. And I think it needs to point out that austerity is an ideological device which is used to pursue these sorts of policies against the public sector, and that it's not innocent, it's not technocratic, that it's a particular ideological attack for political reasons on public services and on poor people. And I think it needs to point out that the austerity is being pursued by a particular political agenda and particular people, and that we can't trust these sectional interests, and that we need a sort of economics or an economy which is for the people as a whole rather than for better off sort of sectional interests. And I think we need to return to what seemed clear after the financial crisis, which is going back a few years now, which is to say that this crisis was caused not by the public sector or the poor, but was caused by an economy which is based on short-term, high-risk gambling. So I mentioned the subprime mortgage market in the US, which was a big part of the beginnings of this crisis, and that's almost been forgotten, and I think we need to sort of put that back on the agenda again, and that means putting back on the agenda the issue of regulating that sector of the economy, the financial sector of the economy, and taxing it, and using those taxes on the big gains it's made for more sort of social benefits, and restructuring the economy more for sort of human purposes. And it's a good chance also to put the focus back on the banks again, as institutions which are a big part of the problems that we're facing. They set their own rules, they've managed to escape punishment for the problems that they've caused. In fact, their failure, rather than being subjected to allowing the market to take its course, and the banks have failed, they've been supported by governments and bailed out. And people who work for banks and the top parts of the banks are still taking home very big bonuses and very big rewards. So we need to have a discourse, I think, which addresses those sorts of things, but also which has more positive policy. So it's a chance, austerity is a chance to turn what are quite old-fashioned ideas into ideas which are very relevant to a particular time right now, which is egalitarianism. So we've already talked, and I'm sure you've talked about widening inequalities earlier on today, the idea that the burden needs to be shared more by all parts of society, not just welfare recipients and the public sector, and that corporations need to take more responsibility. So policies around these sorts of areas, so that means fairer taxes on wealth and finance, for instance financial transaction taxes, and really serious policies to try and crack down on tax loopholes and tax havens and these sorts of things, which of course there have been some attempts to do that, but it hasn't been a very robust sort of attempt. And again, they were quite traditional, predictable, old-fashioned policies, but I think they need to be said, which are about investing in jobs and infrastructure in the public sector, all of which are worthwhile areas, but investment in those areas can stimulate growth in the tradition of stimulus sort of economics. And in the UK, we have no party which is putting forward that agenda, although I think in Portugal and some other European countries you do have parties which are putting forward that agenda on the centre-left. And I think the social consequences of the crisis are also a good chance to raise the issue of the social Europe. So I remember in the late 1990s when you had centre-left parties in power all across Europe, in many countries in Europe, and it seemed like a great chance to further the social agenda in Europe. But actually what those centre-left parties did, and I led, I'm afraid, by the Prime Minister of Britain, was to deregulate the economy rather than build a more sort of social Europe. So the social consequences of the crisis, I think, are a good time to try and rebuild a sort of consensus behind a sort of social Europe. And the sort of groups that can be involved in doing this, people, when I go around sort of saying this in pubs and bars and so on, people say, who's going to support this agenda? And there's a guy called Guy Standing, who I guess some of you may have come across, who's written about a group which he calls the Precariat, by which he means a whole bunch of people in societies, your country, my country and other countries, who are insecure, they lead precarious existences, they're in and out of jobs, they have periods of unemployment, they have different kinds of jobs, they have to juggle different things, and they're not just working class people, they're middle class people, they're people who work in, who work in the sort of institutes that you work in and that I work in. And so this kind of precariat are the kind of groups which are behind sort of global protests and the Occupy movement, which was mentioned earlier on. So I think we have a group a precarious group in society which has become much more significant. And many of them are the students who I teach. When I mention this in classes, my students say, you're talking about us. And they must be the same students that you teach as well. So these are the sorts of groups that are behind that. So that's one sort of alternative, and that's quite a traditional alternative, and probably lots of you there are thinking, well, what's new about this? We've heard this before, and it's true that you would have heard that before, but I wanted to mention a couple of other alternatives which austerity makes possible, which are, again, these are not new alternatives, but they're ones which are not really part of the mainstream at the moment. And one is about work, and it may seem a bit funny for somebody to start talking about restructuring work or having less work in a period when there's such mass unemployment, especially huge youth unemployment. But investment is one solution to unemployment, but another solution to unemployment, which is less growth-oriented, is to rethink the way we redistribute work in society and have a redistribution of working time. So what André Gortz, the French philosopher, talked about, all of us working less so that all of us can have work. So you redistribute people from the people who work a lot to the people who don't have any work. And austerity is a great chance to revive this idea. And it's it's a difficult idea to sell to people who, for instance, who are on the left, who've all seen the solutions to people's problems as being about work, more jobs, more pay, better conditions at work, who see work as a solution to poverty. If people on the Marxist left see the solutions to capitalism as being about exploitation and alienation in the workplace and production. And for many people, including I guess many of you, work is an important part of our lives, where we have, we earn money and it gives us great purpose and fulfillment. and so on. So it's a difficult case to argue against, against work might be too much of a radical thing to say, but against fetishizing work so much. But for lots of people, many parts of their jobs are pointless. They do it because they have to earn money. It's a compulsion. For lots of people, it's dominated. At my workplace, when they have surveys of the staff, 20% of people, every time they have a survey, they say that they've been subjected to bullying by their bosses. Lots of people want to slow down. So my interest in the slow society was mentioned earlier on, to go part-time. I have to admit I have an interest in this. I'm going part-time in a few months, and to be more autonomous and to do more fulfilling kinds of things. And Marx has talked about this, and Keynes has talked about this, and Andre Gortz, who I mentioned a minute ago, talked about this. They've talked about societies that have such high levels of technological development that we can produce the same amount of things without having to work so much. But of course, the way we've used this high levels of technological development is not to work less, but is to work more and produce more things and live in a more consumerist society. But it gives us the chance to actually work less and to redistribute some of the work that we do to those who are unemployed or poor, and to give us more autonomy. Because I think a large amount of our lack of autonomy comes in the employment relation that we're in, and to produce more creative and social activities, care, spend more time with the relationships and family, and actually to spend more time in political activity, because that's a time-consuming thing to do. And this may sound a utopian idea, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think utopian ideas are good things because they help us to reach towards things which seem impossible now but may become more possible in the future. But actually there are many quite practical things we can do to introduce this sort of lower work society. So the universal basic income, there's a big literature on the universal basic income and the practicalities of it and the way it can replace very complex social payments, benefits payments systems. Fair taxes and redistribution can pay for people working less. We have legislation on working hours in many countries, and of course we have a 48-hour maximum week in the EU legislation. So these legislation on working hours can be made stronger, and we can move from societies which are based on minimum wages to societies based more on...
Sorry, move from?
We go from societies which are based more on a minimum wage, which obviously not all European societies have. So Germany is just having the discussion at the moment, but to move society based more on a sort of living wage, and so not based on a minimum but on an amount that we need to live. And all of these things would allow a shift towards society, partly based on less paid work, but also based on one where we can redistribute work from those who have it to those who don't. And I'm not saying this is necessarily something we should do right now in conditions of austerity, when growth is something we need to get out of austerity. And I'm not saying it's something that should be done, for instance, in developing countries, where, again, growth is a strict priority. And I mention this in the context of austerity because it's about equality, the redistribution of work. It's about employment, which is a big problem under austerity. It's about greater opportunities to participate in politics and democracy, and about restructuring the economy around quality of life, and having an economy which is based around human needs rather than humans being geared towards what they can do in the economy. So these are various things to do with shifting our attitude to work, which I think austerity gives us the opportunity to think about and move towards a different sort of attitude to work. And the final thing I really wanted to, other alternative and the final alternative I wanted to mention, I know you've had a long day, so I'm going to go on too much longer, but it's to do with migration. The movement of people, because I think also austerity gives us, strange as it may seem, austerity gives us the chance to have a different attitude towards the movement of people. It's very relevant to the austerity period. One of the things which happens when there's economic crises and an economic downturn is people try and find a scapegoat. We've seen it in Europe in the 20th century, and we're seeing it now, especially in Greece, and I know in other countries. And so you get this anti-immigration rhetoric, and the left participate in this rhetoric just as much as the right do. And the left tend to be concerned about their own people, by which they mean not just working class people, but they usually mean people within their own national boundaries as well. So they're concerned about the workers and the poor, but the workers and the poor in Portugal or in Britain or in Greece and not the workers and the poor beyond those national boundaries, even though the workers and the poor beyond those national boundaries are often very needy, as we've seen with people trying to cross the Mediterranean for a long time now and suffering the consequences in many cases. And so they tend to see the class as being within their own national boundaries, and other people on the left, sort of green people on the left or revolutionary people on the left, are much more internationalist. They tend to see, for instance, Marxists see all workers as equal regardless of what nations they come from, and Greens have a more internationalist attitude, a global attitude towards people being all similar. And you get this attitude in the sort of cosmopolitan political theory as well, seeing people as important despite the national boundaries they come from. So what's this got to do with austerity? Well, I think immigration is a solution to the crisis. It's not a problem, which is the way it's treated at the moment. It's a solution to the crisis. So it's very difficult to find an economist who will disagree with some of the things I'm about to say, which is that immigration contributes to growth. It turns people who are unproductive or unemployed in situations of high unemployment into people who are employed and productive in countries they go to. So you're losing lots of people from Portugal at the moment because of this, and in my country we're gaining lots of people because of this sort of. And the people who come to the UK are people who are not taking benefits or social payments. They're people who are working, who are spending their wages and stimulating growth. And there isn't a UK economist who won't agree with that, apart from very, very politically committed anti-immigration ones. And migrants pay tax, generally. This funds public services, the public services which are being decimated at the moment by austerity and welfare. They support the costs of an ageing population, which many countries have a problem with, pensions and healthcare for an ageing population. They're less likely to claim benefits. The evidence is this is very widespread. Immigrants are often projected as people who are trying to get free healthcare or free social payments. But in many countries in Europe, they're much less likely to claim those than the home population. Yes, they spend their wages, they get jobs, they spend their wages, and that creates an economic stimulus. So immigration, like the redistribution of work, can be a solution to the crisis. And again, I asked this question earlier on, who's going to support this? And whenever I have this argument in the pubs and bars again, I don't spend all my time in pubs and bars, but those are two arguments about immigration. People say, who's going to support this pro-immigration project, because there's such anti-immigration attitudes in Europe. But actually, if you look at some of the surveys for people's attitudes to immigration and you break them down, it's not at all clear that there is an anti-immigration mood in different societies. So again, I'm talking about the UK here, but I think you'll find similar things elsewhere. The young, people under 25 in the UK, are much, much more in favour of immigration than people over the age of 50s. If I remember correctly, it's something like 65% of people over 50 in my country express hostile attitudes to immigration, and amongst people under 25, it's something like 20 or 25% expressing hostile attitudes to immigration. So the young, who of course are going to become the middle-aged and the old in the future, are much more pro-immigration. And the other groups of people who are much more pro-immigration are people who live in immigrant areas. So, for instance, in my country, the most pro-immigration part of the UK is London, and London is a city which is absolutely crammed full of immigrants. There's about 300 or 400 languages spoken in this city, and so it's not at all clear that there is a popular mood against immigration amongst particular significant groups, people who are used to immigrants and people who are young. There's a big mood for supporting these sort of pro-immigration policy, and I think it's a freedom and human rights issue, so there's reasons in itself for supporting this. It's about tackling poverty and disadvantage where people come from, because that's the reason why many people emigrate. So these are issues that we should be concerned about, and we can see that borders don't really work anyway. Borders are highly problematic. We can see that in the USA, many of the Mexicans who live in the USA, they're not people who tried to cross the border illegally, they're people who went on holiday and then never went back again, and we can see that the borders are not working. Yes, for instance, in southern Europe, people are crossing these borders, and many people are dying trying to cross these borders. So I think it's time that we accepted that borders are something we should open, rather than things that we should try and keep to operate in a way which doesn't really sort of work. So that's really it. I just wanted to finish. That's really all I wanted to say. I just really wanted to finish by summarising sort of really what I wanted to argue today. And I think it's I'm really disappointed I couldn't be there to hear the talks and to have more informal discussions with people, because I think this is, when Sophia contacted me, I thought this was a really exciting theme for a conference that not just talks about austerity but deals with the inequalities in rights. And I guess what I want to say is I don't see austerity as a necessity, which is the way it's projected in the discourses about it. I think, as I've said, I think it's a project which is pushed by richer people in society and neoliberal interest groups against poorer people in society and against the public sector. So I think it's a class project. I think it's an ideological project. I think there are alternatives to it. That's partly what I really wanted to talk about. I think some of these alternatives are quite old ones, which have suddenly become less old-fashioned because they're very relevant to austerity. I think some of them are ones which are outside the mainstream, so the ones I talked about just now about work and migration. And I think all of these sort of approaches, the old-fashioned ones, the work approaches and the migration approaches, can all help with austerity, and they all also have benefits of their own. And that's all I really wanted to say, and I'm really glad I managed to finally make it and talk to you, even if I'm not talking in a more interactive way. And it's been really nice to be here, and thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
Luke, I'm so sorry that you had to look at me all the time while you were talking, because we cannot turn around the laptop, so you cannot, for technical reasons, and we already had technical problems, so I won't risk that. So the audience was very pleased to hear your talk, and thank you for providing us with a whole bouquet of very solid and inspiring arguments for our discussion. We had a long day indeed, and we are very close to the bars and restaurants which you were talking about. Unfortunately, missing your company today. But about the whole conference, I'm sure we keep contact. You are in contact with Sophia. Normally, we have some material, either there are videos of the sessions or any kind of documentation, so that you can somehow still enjoy what was going on today, virtually or electronically. However, I'm so glad that your final point was on migration. Having London in mind, with 139 countries of origin, as far as I'm recalling, Portugal is currently aware of more or less the same number of countries of destination with regard to the immigration of Portuguese people. And of course, as all the other governments of other countries, which are countries of immigration where people leave, economists and governments are well aware about the diasporas being important resources for the homeland in terms of financial or human capital, all the networks, everything, what they are doing while they are there, the remittances, but far beyond. And we know the very good concepts in migration studies about also social and cultural remittances, not only for the economy. Okay, now I'm accepting comments and questions for this great paper, and I will describe to Luke how you look like when you put a question. If you're not ready to come up here, I will say how they look before you reply. Okay, who is the first one? Okay.
You mentioned this idea of sharing work.
Okay, do you have a mic? Can Luke hear you? Or do you want to come here to talk to Luke? That would be okay. You stay.
It's less intimidating.
Okay.
Now you're mentioning the.
Can you hear it, Luke?
Can you hear? Okay. Yeah. You were mentioning the debate about the experience of sharing work, and this whole debate within the French left about the right to work versus the right to income. But the experience of sharing work was tried in France during the Jospin government, and it didn't work. Basically because the implication was, the result was a significant fall in productivity. And I'm just wondering, if that experience failed, why and how can it be an alternative now?
Okay.
Did you understand everything?
I don't know all of it. He's talking about sharing work and experience under the Jospin government not working.
In France, yeah. But something will be added by our colleague Angela to exactly this question.
Yeah, it's just about the same point.
Yeah.
Related with migration, because you think of these connected alternatives, I imagine, but if you have too much migration to a place, then you have much more people to redistribute work. And what about income? Because are there any sociologically grounded studies that tell you that people would not mind to see their income really decreasing in order to have work? I mean, people that have work, they don't want to decrease their income. How to do it? How to convince, to persuade people to people that have work to just work in part-time? Because I would love to work in part-time. I think that almost everybody would love to work in part-time if that would allow people to have life conditions that were enough to proceed. How to do it?
Okay, these two questions.
Yeah, I didn't hear too much of the last one. I noticed about the problems that people working.
It was, in short, it was, how can you convince people to share work, and especially those people who have work, how can you convince them to work less? Because it will also affect their salaries, and so consequently their life quality if they have reduced salaries. So everybody would like to work less, but not necessarily to be worse paid.
Okay.
Isn't it? Okay.
Okay, yeah, so they're really good questions, and I don't have very immediate and very strong answers to both of those questions, but I'm aware of these problems. They're discussed, they're discussed in relation to this proposal of less paid work. The Jospin, I mean, I guess you probably won't find this very convincing, but I think with the Jospin case, I think what's needed in the restructuring of work and having shorter working hours, which of course is also the French experience, not just sharing work, but having shorter working hours. I think these things need, these are issues which need long-term structural change. I don't think these are things that you can write off because of what happens under a particular government in a particular electoral cycle. And that sounds like I'm being very dismissive of the point, which I'm not. I think it's a really important point about to look at experiences of sharing work and having shorter working hours under a particular government that tries it. But I think this is something, it's like all sorts of progressive change. It's about being open about immigration itself. It's about sexual equality between men and women, about being open towards homosexuality and all kinds of different political changes. Something which happens in one electoral cycle under one government can go wrong, and these are things which require long-term attitudinal change and long-term structural change. So in relation to the first question about Jospin, I do really accept the point. I do accept the point, and I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I just think there are progressive ideas which are important, which will lead to quality of life, which will take more than one electoral cycle, which require structural change in society and require long-term attitudinal change. So I think you have to keep trying, basically. I realise that's not a very convincing answer, and I'm sure that speaker is shaking his head at me. And in relation to Angela's point, which was about lowering life quality. Her point was about lowering life quality if people are working less. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think again, I guess my answer to that is a similar one. Really, I think the project of well, first of all, there are very practical responses to that, which are things that I talked about, such as having a living wage, having a redistributive economic system, having a guaranteed minimum income, which replaces some of the lost income. And these are not crazy ideas. There's big literature by policymakers and academics about the universal basic income. So working, and of course, if you have a universal basic income, let's say it's 100 euros a week or 100 euros a month, that means you don't have to work so much and some of your income is replaced by that. So that's a small sort of practical, there are some practical issues to do with replacing lost income, but I guess the bigger answer to that question about people working less and therefore having less money and having less quality of life is that it's a different kind of life. We need to try and really think about a different kind of life. So it may be that people have less money, although, as I just mentioned, I'm not sure that necessarily has to be the case. But if it is that people have less money, that we have to sort of work towards a society which has a better quality of life in terms of autonomy of time. See the quality of life in terms of the autonomy we have over time and the power we have over our own lives and our time, rather than in terms of purely financial advantage. And I realise that there are lots of poor people, and I realise that in Portugal, especially at the moment, the situation is very economically hard. So for me to sort of say we shouldn't worry too much about money seems a problematic thing to say. But I think the whole issue of working less and sharing work is to do with an attitudinal change where we have a more human-centred society, which is based on autonomy and time to do things which are creative and social, as much as it is to do with economics and finance. We need to have that sort of shift in the way, in what we value in society. So I think that's what I would say to that question.
Yeah, exactly. The question is coming from a context where we also dealing with severe salary cuts in academia, etc. I guess if you put the same question to middle class people in the Nordic countries, there will be very different answers, because if you are already calculating always at the edge, then of course working less is very nice, but how can you manage? But on the other hand, when you have a look at the Nordic countries, where people can choose if both, in a family, if both partners are working full-time, or one is only working half-time, or both 3/4, and even though they would earn more, they take another choice. I mean, but if the concept is for the countries where economy is in crisis, I guess it's really a long-term project of severe structural changes. Okay, further questions? Another comment or question? Luke. I'm very fond of your paper, very fond that the connection did still happen to work, and we were all enjoying the talk very much. All the handouts, well, we still have some, but I guess they are being studied. Look, we will keep contact. We will miss you a lot at dinner, and I hope that your back is getting better, that you are recovering quickly. And thanks so much for joining us, okay?
Thank you for having me. Have a nice evening.
You too, bye-bye.